Hello, and welcome to today's session in Communication and Psychology. As always, make sure that before we begin, you have the PowerPoint lecture notes printed in front of you. This way you can take notes along the way, and this will be helpful when we have our discussion in class. Okay, so if you've got the PowerPoint lecture notes in front of you, we're ready to begin. Today, on two main issues. We'll be talking about communication and psychology with respect to the very well-known database called PubMed. And then later on, we'll get to communication and psychology with respect to APA-style research reports. Remember that APA stands for American Psychological Association. So let's get into the very first topic, which is communication and psychology with respect to PubMed. Many of you are familiar with PubMed. I know in class we've used PubMed many times already. What you might not know is that PubMed is a database that's made available by the National Institutes of Health, and you might know them as NIH. You'll see that phrase very frequently in all kinds of psychological research. You might also know that this is part of the National Library of Medicine. This is the NLM. Some people will refer to that acronym from time to time. So these two different organizations, the National Library of Medicine and the National Institutes, plural of Health, are the ones who put together the PubMed database. It's available all over the world, which I think is wonderful that the U.S. government, which is supporting this, makes the information therein available to anybody, anywhere. And it's, I think, very heartening that we are at a stage in our human development when we can do that. Let's see if we can now get into some details about the PubMed database. Here, what we have, and I'll highlight it, is the URL that you can highlight if you like and paste that into your browser. You don't have to do that now, but in class we'll spend a lot of time doing that, and we'll be able to go through many different exercises in class. Another way to get to this link, if that's too long a name for you to paste in or to remember, you can always go to a simple search engine, maybe like Google, and you can put in PubMed, and once you put that in, you'll come to a link just like this, and that might be a more accessible way. So either of those will be fine. And in class, we'll do a variety of exercises where we will try to retrieve many different kinds of articles in the PubMed database. Many are related to the medical sciences, some are related to the behavioral sciences, and we can retrieve them lots of different ways. For example, we can put in my name or one of my student co-authors. This was Tiffany Saffel. So we can put in Saffel and Matthews and see what kinds of articles are written in the PubMed database by folks with those last names. Another one of my students was Ray Stanley. He and I published a paper, so we could retrieve those. Lots of different ways of retrieving information in PubMed. Importantly, sometimes you won't know the name of a particular researcher. Instead, you'll have an idea about a particular kind of topic. Maybe you're a memory researcher, or you want to get into the study of memory and you're particularly intrigued by amnesia. So you can put in amnesia as a search term, and maybe you're also interested in not only amnesia, but a particular kind of methodology, such as case studies. And we've recently had some conversation about case studies, where typically we're taking advantage of what we might call natural experiments, where we don't have a directly manipulated variable. Instead, we're waiting for nature to take its course, and sometimes this renders somebody perhaps less able to remember something, maybe imposing on them, at least temporarily, or maybe for a longer term, some amnesia. So whatever the situation might be, we have these different search terms that we can put into PubMed, and we can then get long lists of research that's been done maybe over the last 50 years or so on those topics, if we're putting in topics, or we can also search by last name. We can do combinations of these things. We can do amnesia and Saffel, for example. We can also put in dates as search terms. We can search by journal article names or journal article titles. The title of a particular article might be Psychological Science in the real world. The title of the journal might be Psychological Science. Lots of different ways to search. We can search by date, for example. What's really important here, though, is that developing these PubMed skills are going to be very important for what we might describe as your receptive skills in acquiring psychological information. And before you become an effective producer of psychological information, it's important that you've received psychological information and you know a lot about the topic that you're going to be investigating. Otherwise, you might be reinventing the wheel. So getting this receptive component down is very important. PubMed is really good for helping us do that. On and talk a little bit about how we can develop APA-style research reports. This, again, is American Psychological Association research reports. And there's a note here that I think is important, especially for students at Denison University or perhaps other small liberal arts colleges. And that is that we're going to go through some details here of how to write an APA-style research report. But a lot of folks around the country who are in college never get the opportunity to do this. And the reason is doing an APA-style research report is really quite time-intensive, both for the student, but also for the professor who would have to grade this. And sometimes when you're at institutions where there are relatively few professors for the number of students at the school, then it becomes impractical for the professor to be able to grade APA-style research reports. At much smaller schools, though, where you have a better faculty ratio, you have a chance of having the faculty be able to look at the reports that the students have written. Here at Denison, what I think you might find interesting is that it is required of all Denison psychology majors that they write 4 APA-style reports to get a BA, and we actually have to have our students write 6 APA-style reports for them to get a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. And the reason, again, is that at Denison, we're a relatively quote-unquote high-touch institution, and we do require our students to produce a lot of pre-graduate school level material before we allow them to graduate from our program. So let's take a look at the APA report and some guidelines for the research writing. The folks who are at Denison, who are going to pursue either a minor or a major in psychology, they'll get a lot of opportunities to write APA-style research reports in our 200-level research courses, and then again in our 300-level research courses. So let's take a little preview of what you might be seeing here at Denison if you move on to any of the courses that require this kind of assignment, an APA-style research report. Okay, so what's important about this is that what you'll recognize is that whether you're a consumer of information or somebody who's producing information, it'll be very important that you have a title page that has some critical components on it. So this is going to be the first of several components in our APA-style report. I'll put a 1 in the upper left-hand corner. And here, we're going to start out with the title. And we want to make sure that the title is more than anything else relevant to what you're doing. You want to get a title that captures very accurately the research question that you've investigated, and maybe even the method that you used. The title can't be very long, but it does have to be very relevant. And that might sound like a trivial statement, but you'd be surprised how frequently when I'm reviewing papers, there's a mismatch between what the researchers actually do and what they have titled their paper. You want to make sure there's a nice correspondence here. Okay, then we list the authors, and there's an important point here that is almost about the notion of politics in science. So I'll put the word politics here. Politics generally is the issue of who gets what, right? Who gets access to what, and being a first author on a scientific paper is actually very important for one's career, and it can be considered the most prestigious position of all the authors that might be listed. If you are first, then that's an indication that this is primarily your work, or that you are the lead author, you are the one who maybe had the greatest intellectual input. So if you're a graduate student someday, you want to ideally be able to claim that you're not only an author on a peer-reviewed paper that takes the form of a APA-style report, but also that you might be first author. Sometimes there are fields that will try to get around this problem so that we can stop some of the fighting that goes on with respect to who's first author and who's second author and so forth. And so what will happen is, in some fields, they will simply list the authors alphabetically, and there's no debate about that. Okay, then we have also an author affiliation. It's important that you list, for ethical reasons, your institutional affiliation. Many of the Denison students would put down Denison University. Sometimes what happens is a given author will have more than one author affiliation. So it might be the case, for example, that you are an undergraduate here and you start a project at Denison, and you would list Denison as your author affiliation, but then maybe you go off to some other institution for graduate school, and you continue to work on this project that you started at Denison, but maybe completed at graduate school. A couple of examples here. My own students have started projects with me here at Denison, and then after graduation they've gone on to Notre Dame in one case, and NYU in another case, and so by the time the report comes out, that person's author affiliation will be both Denison University and either Notre Dame or NYU. Then typically we have a brief one-phrase heading that we sometimes call the running head, and this is going to appear on each page of the manuscript, typically up here in the upper right-hand corner. Okay? So that's the title, our first component. Then we'll have, on any article that we might be submitting for publication, we're going to have a page 2, or I should say section 2, that's going to be the abstract. Believe it or not, in some ways, this might be the most important section of your entire paper. And the reason is that the abstract is typically the only component that makes it into PubMed. So earlier we talked about the importance of PubMed if we're trying to educate ourselves on a research topic. And to do that, other researchers from around the world are going to be looking at pre-existing research, and that might include your research. And they might have access only to your abstract for practical reasons, so you want to give them a really good idea of what went on, what problem was being investigated. You might give them a brief summary of the method and the participants. You might hear name, for example, the species that was used. Not all psychologists investigate humans, although most of us do most of the time. But remember that psychology is really about behaviors, thoughts, and feelings of essentially any organism. So it can be any number of different kinds of species that might be investigated. So you might describe who the participants were and how many there were. Then you can give a brief summary of the data. Typically we don't offer numbers here, and we might include a statement about something being statistically significant, but we usually don't have here f-values and p-values or t-values or chi-square values. We just say something that was statistically significant or not. And then we sometimes have a 1 or 2 sentence summary about what might be implied by our findings. So this is your experiment in a nutshell, or your correlational study in a nutshell. And again, this might be the only thing that the majority of people will ever see about your research report, and that's why the abstract is so important. We'll go on to the next section, which is the intro, and we'll call this part 3. And the introduction does lots of different things for the reader. It describes the problem or the phenomenon under investigation, and here we can begin to state exactly what it is we mean when we use some of the terminology that we do. Here again we'll use operational definitions, and in this way we can set the stage for the research and also give the reader some idea about what we might mean for, say, intelligence, or what we might mean for personality. And at that point, if the reader has a different idea about intelligence or personality, the reader would know not to go any further. But it's important to set the stage and contextualize things for our reader here in the introduction. Remember, it's important to recognize that science is never done in a vacuum, right? We're going to try to develop the relationship of the research that we're describing here in our own research report to what's been done previously. And this is a really good opportunity for you to connect your work to pre-existing literature, and you'll have lots of citations to help you do that. And then you'll begin to narrow things down a little bit and say, well, given all this background that we have from the other studies that have been done, a current question that remains open is such and so. And then you can begin to describe the purpose of your study, what you might predict based on some hypotheses that you might be evaluating, and now you've set the stage very nicely for the next section, section number 4. I'll jot that in here. This will be the method section. Okay, so in the method section, we have to do a lot of things. Almost in all journals, I would say that the first thing that you state is that the Denison University Institutional Review Board has approved this study, so that we know that we have informed consent issues taken care of, and that we've taken care of issues related to money or other compensation. Everybody's been debriefed. We get the ethical issues by the horns, and we make sure that we are very upfront on communicating that we in fact do have a ethically conducted study here, and that an institutional review board has approved everything. We even mention that typically before we talk about who the participants were. And again, the participants can be human or non-human. We sometimes give the relevant demographic information, but we don't have to go crazy here with demographic information. We only need to say, for example, how many people were participating, if it's people, or how many non-human animals. And if the study is using participant variables, for example, gender or age, then you would include information about gender and age. But you're not always obligated to do that if the investigation is not really about gender or age, or if there's no plausible reason to believe that gender or age are relevant variables. Okay? The next major section within the method would be the apparatus or materials. Here you have to describe the stimulation that you're using. In most psychology studies, the stimuli would include such things as surveys that you might have used. It might include such things as screen images that people had to respond to or sounds to which they had to respond to. Maybe folks were being injected with different kinds of chemicals or placebos, whatever the case might be. We're describing our materials in sufficient detail that they can replicate. And you might remember our earlier conversations on replication. And this is always a difficult balance to strike. We're going to try to describe what the participants are doing in this study without getting overly narrative about this. We don't need to say that the participants came into Nap Hall room 405. It's not really relevant to replicating the study whether participants were in Nap room 405 or some other room in that building. We don't need to say that the participants were escorted to a seat where they read the informed consent. We try to avoid being overly narrative and include everything that needs to be included for replication and leave out anything that is not essential for replication. That's the general rule driving what is included in the method section. Okay, so why don't we go on, which is going to be section number 5. So we're making our way on through. And we'll talk here about the results. And what we're going to begin with is a statement of purpose for our analysis. So we might say something like, we looked at the comparison between the two groups in the various conditions stated here. And you can begin to lay that out and offer some descriptive statistics first. I think that can be most important. Oops, didn't mean to put that in. Let me take that out. We'll now use this. The descriptive statistics will typically include pictures that will very clearly describe the means and standard deviations. Sometimes if you have a scatter plot, you might have a best fitting line. And frequently on the scatter plot, it's reasonable to put the R-squared value that shows how much of the variability the trend line is accounting for. Later on in the text, within the results section, you can talk about inferential statistics, and you can give some details about maybe the main effects that will each have their own f-values and p-values and eta-squared values. You might remember here that in inferential statistics, we also like to report the power associated with any effect that might be null. And this gives the reader some indication of how likely it was that you might have found a significant outcome. Okay, and then we're going to refrain from interpreting in this section the results. We're just going to state them in a very matter-of-fact way. And we're not going to try to draw any conclusions at this point. We'll save that for the next, which is going to be our discussion section. It's going to be section number 6. So we're making our way on through here. Okay, and here we can begin by very briefly restating the purpose of the study. And the reason why you'd want to do that is very rarely is it the case that people are going to be reading your study from start to finish. There will be a handful of people who do that, but most people are going to be bouncing around in your study trying to get the gist of what you've done without actually having to read the whole thing. There will be some who will read it through, but not very many. Okay, so we're going to try to state the purpose of the study at the beginning of the discussion for those of us who have advanced to that point in your paper without reading all the other details, and we'll give maybe a one-paragraph summary of what we found and how this might relate to your hypothesis. After we do that, a very commonly used tactic is to next go on to alternative interpretations of our findings. It might be that we have a particular interpretation, but here we need to be modest. We need to, for example, say that we believe that these data suggest such and so, but an alternate possibility is this or that. And it is reasonable at this point to add some additional citations that might support these alternative interpretations. It is equally reasonable to say why you might believe that these alternative explanations are possible but perhaps unlikely. And you might develop an argument there, perhaps based on some of the data that you've collected. Okay, and then more broadly, you can begin to talk about the relevance of your findings to the literature, and here's another opportunity to demonstrate that your science is not being conducted in a vacuum. Instead, you're connecting your work very tightly to other literature, and it might be the case that you have a disconfirmation of other work. Maybe you're finding something that doesn't corroborate what earlier researchers have found, and you might begin to speculate on why that's the case. Were there methodological differences? Might it be the case that you had a different kind of a sample? These are some of the possibilities for coming up with differences between what you've done and what other researchers have done. On the other hand, it might be the case that you very firmly confirm what's gone on earlier in the literature, and if that's the case, then you can say so, and you can give particular citations, and you might say that the data make either a good qualitative and or quantitative match to prior research, and you might say that we confirm prior research. You might even say that we extend prior research by adding these new conditions or these new kinds of samples. Finally, you might begin to conclude by offering some future directions. Any one study is always limited, and you might here talk about some of the limitations of your studies, and in so doing, you're at least implicitly stating what future directions might be for additional work on this topic. Okay, then finally, it's appropriate to conclude with the references that you've needed to develop your context for your study. And here you can also place your acknowledgments. After the reference sections, we'll have an acknowledgments bit. And you might say, well, what kinds of things go into the acknowledgments? Well, typically, we thank the people. I'll draw a hypothetical person here. There's my cartoon person. You might thank the various people who were central to the intellectual development of your study. So it might be the case that your paper was reviewed by anonymous reviewers, and you might just say something like, we are grateful to 2 anonymous reviewers for helpful comments on early versions of this manuscript. It might be that there was somebody who contributed at your institution to the work, but didn't quite rise to the level of authorship. So you might thank them for help with data collection, or for assistance in preparing the stimuli, or what the case might be. You might also want to thank the institutions that funded you or offered you some kind of support. This might be a grant from the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation. Here at Denison University, the university itself often offers money to students and to faculty to make the research possible, so you might acknowledge your funding sources. In fact, a lot of people would argue that this is absolutely critical, because if there is a conflict of interest in who's funding the study, then we have an ethical obligation to at least disclose those funding sources. That becomes a very important component in the acknowledgments section. And then after that, sometimes we have appendices that might develop more fully the proofs for certain mathematical theorems, or maybe we have supplementary information here that goes beyond what would have otherwise been shown in the primary text. It might have broken up the flow because there might be too much detail there, but there might be some people who are interested in that appendix level information. So these are the different components of a APA-style report, and what we can say is that an APA-style report is something that is difficult to write and does take a lot of practice. Fortunately, at Denison, you'll write several of these, as I alluded to earlier, and what will also happen is after you've done your APA-style report, at the end of a semester in our 200-level research courses, students are required to do poster presentations, and this is another important component of communication in psychology. At a poster, it is pretty much what it sounds like. You'll have a summary shown visually of the work that you've done, and you'll be asked to give maybe a 3 or 4 minute summary of your research, and that's actually quite difficult to do. And the reason is you might have been working on this for the entire semester, or a good fraction of the semester, and to succinctly summarize what you've done over all those weeks in just a couple of minutes is really an art that has to be refined with lots and lots of practice. But all the Denison students do this at the 200 level at the end of the semester. Also, at the 300 level, they do a different kind of communication medium or forum, and that is the research talk. And it's simply called a talk. Oops, excuse me, left out my L there. And the talks are now conducted again at the end of the semester. For us here at Denison, they're conducted at the 300 level. And what we'll have is typically the other classmates are listening to your talk, the professor, and usually other professors will be in the room at the time. And here we can say that you've got now maybe a 12-minute interval to summarize what you've done, and then typically we take 3 minutes for questions. At professional conferences, we find that there are frequently sessions that contain posters and sessions that contain talks. Of these, we can say that the posters typically allow a relatively high level of feedback. That is, you can have a very extended conversation with somebody who really wants to get into the details of your poster. And I've been at posters sometimes for nearly 1 hour, having a one-on-one conversation with the researcher who's done some new work. And I've had other folks come and chat with me for tens of minutes, sometimes as long as an hour at my poster. By contrast, at a talk, you don't get that kind of intensive feedback. On the other hand, with a talk, you have the opportunity to present your research to literally hundreds of people at one shot. This poster is more like a one-on-one session or a one-on-few. The talks give you the potential to have maybe a couple of hundred people hear you and see you. So at different points in your career, the talks can be especially important. This is really the case when you're finishing up graduate school and you're trying to find a job. It's great to get a lot of visibility in the talk where several hundred people might see you at one time. Whereas if you want more intimate feedback on the project that you're working on, the poster might be the better format. Okay, so that concludes our conversation today. As always, please make sure that you've made a note of what's been clear and what's been unclear, and we look forward to having that conversation in class. See you in class.